bringing up Travis's presentation. I just want to introduce Travis Anderson. He's with the Boston Planning and Development Office, and he's a senior planner in. I'm sorry, so senior infrastructure and energy planner, and Travis is actually going to talk about from the Boston Planning and Development Association, and works very closely with the city of Boston, which certainly has very high goals and so forth. So we're glad that Travis could make it here in person. So Travis, I'm going to do the magic mic. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Mike and Dana for putting this together, and MassDEP for hosting. As Mike mentioned, I'm Travis Anderson, Senior Infrastructure Energy Planner at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. I am trained as an architect. I work on our comprehensive planning team at the agency, where we look at more sort of a macro level planning initiatives throughout Boston. And one of those initiatives that we look at is called the Boston Smart Utilities Program. So I oversee the program and policy for smart utilities. And a key aspect of that is thermal decarbonization. It's one of the guidelines and principles that will hopefully allow us to meet our 2050 goals. And why do we do Boston Smart Utilities? I think at this phase, I'll take a little bit more of a macro approach. I think the conversation, especially with Saul, has been a lot more sort of technical, getting into the weeds and nuances of this technology. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about what that means from a broader scale. Like, how do we start to integrate and interface with other utilities that lie in the ground? How do we start to think of that in the broader planning context, district systems, and future potential analysis? So really the key benefits of Boston Smart Utilities is it just makes everything easier to build and maintain. We like to make sure that business as usual principles are followed throughout the city. The streets get opened periodically or more than periodically often in the city of Boston. And we want to make sure that, we can maintain the kind of key economic flows throughout the city. And then a big part of this is just how do we integrate and investigate innovative technologies, what's happening in the thermal, like decarbonization atmosphere. And really what we're talking about is the unseen right away. So thinking about how do we sort of standardize or think of complete streets for the underground, especially when we have these large scale developments come online, or we have opportunities to build new city streets within Boston. And really, how does that affect and start to impact what happens above? So really, we're looking at heat mitigation, we're looking at stormwater, we're looking at ways in which we can share curb space for multimodal transportation and other elements that occur, but that sometimes is impacted by what happens below and how things can get accessed underground. But really, I think the Pie in the Sky initiative is to have a concept where we have lots of trees, we have lots of resilience built in to the right of way, and also from the private development standpoint. So we can really start to address urban heat island, which is becoming more and more of a key issue in the city, not only in Boston, but throughout the state of New England. How do we start to address issues around stormwater by integrating new, what we call green infrastructure practices, shifting away a little bit more from the gray principles and elevating that to the street level, using like bioswales, rain gardens, tree infiltration pits, and really thinking about that in terms of how to better mitigate stormwater. And of course, big part of the conversation today is how does it start to focus on decarbonization or electrification in general, right? So we know we have a electrical grid that is not so much a grid in the city of Boston. It kind of zigs and zags and goes everywhere. But how do we actually make sure and ensure that we have the capacity to decarbonize, and then having principles like sewer heat recovery that have good coefficients of performance? We can extract more energy per kilowatt out of that and start instituting that into buildings. And then look at that from a lens of environmental justice as well. So if we have capacity issues in a certain area, we can sort of elevate, key principles of building electrification and decarbonization at the same time. So really, a lot of my work falls into two buckets. The first bucket is the smart utility standards. and I'll discuss those first. And then the second is really the smart utilities policy for Article zoning review. So this is where we capture any project coming through the pipeline that's 50,000 square feet or above. They have to start looking at key policy and regulations through that review process that we take in, analyze, and then sort of work with the proponent on. So the smart utility standards. The biggest one that we look at, this, I'll talk about this more in detail later, is sort of this district energy, or what we call advanced energy concepts. This applies to projects that are 1.5 million square feet or above. So a large scale project comes with a master plan, typically, adding to new street networks. And really what we're trying to do is how do we sort of cluster buildings into an all electric efficient concept? And how can we connect that to the distribution? How can we incorporate different use types? And then how can we think about providing an energy corridor? So we have this new street network going in, and what's starting to think about how does that duct bank function underneath the street? For projects that are 100,000 square feet or above, we look at green infrastructure best practices. We're starting to work with our green infrastructure director and the streets department on standardizing best practices for the right of way. And I think this is a kind of a key concept for us when we look at utility site plans, to ensuring that there's no conflicts with laterals coming in, and making sure that these elements in the right of way can thrive and stay green, right, and grow and provide, and also have this kind of subline engineering component of stormwater capture. We also look at adaptive signal technology. So when I talk about complete streets for the underground, it's really thinking about complete streets for above, and how do we start incorporating pedestrian safety through, shadow conduit, providing access to sensors, deploying those throughout our street network. And then that also rolls into smart streetlights. We actually just did a full city audit of the 76,000 streetlights that the city of Boston has under its purview, where they are, what conditions they're in. We have a geospatial map, and then we can start thinking about what other elements can we add on to that streetlight network if they start to transfer to newer technologies, better LED, that sort of thing. And then another key principle that we look at a large scale for the 1.5 million square feet or above is this concept of a telecom utilidor. So this really gets back to thinking about equity and principles, access to broadband, new technologies. We all know that no one likes to share the same conduit. So what happens when a new provider comes in, and we want to make sure that that duct bank is in place, again, to keep that business as usual functioning throughout the city. We don't have to open up the streets to do all this. What we are missing, you'll see, is something around thermal decarbonization. So as we start to look at our smart utility standards, we start incorporating these duct banks, electrical utilidor, but we're not really addressing the thermal aspect yet with these laterals or potential other connections that we can make out of the existing sewer or newer technologies that might come online. And so that's one of our goals, is how do we start implementing a key strategy or standard around this, and working with our state and quasi partners at Boston Water Sewer. How can we start incorporating this into our better practices of street networks? And this starts to really get unpacked within our, the second bucket, the article review, which we call advanced energy and advanced feasibility assessments. And part of that assessment really starts to look at a clustering of these technologies. And did I just lose my mic? No.
Yeah. Maybe it's the battery. Oh, that's not good.
No, that is good.
Okay. I can move that over.
Sure.
Let's see.
Lean in here.
Well, it's actually pretty sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just leave it there.
Okay,
We can
sure.
talk now.
Okay.
But for the people in the back of the room, you do need to speak.
Okay. All right. So what we look at with these advanced energy feasibility assessments is kind of listed out here. And I love the conversation this morning around how do we actually layer on co-beneficial strategies for renewable energy. It's not just about sewer heat recovery or waste energy recovery. It's not just about geothermal. It's not just about PVs. It's not just about batteries. But how do we look at that in a holistic context of, infusing that into a potential project? And we're actually granted the opportunity with projects of this scale to start investigating those principles. So we look at low temperature thermal loops, geothermal technologies. We look at the sanitary sewer, black water, or seawater heat exchanges of interest of us since we're a coastal city. Vehicle to grid is something that's coming online. We actually have about one nuclear power plant's worth of lithium ion batteries existing in cars today. That is something we could tap into the future. And we also look at solar thermal, or actually like storage capacity, so we can start addressing peak demand if we're looking at a lab, which is one of our high ventilation buildings, in conjunction with a residential building. How can we kind of have them share and combine heat or resources for peak load management? And then water collection and reuse, that was mentioned earlier as well. Like there is a sort of reuse or sort of water principle associated with all this work. So the focus today, of course, is on wastewater energy, sanitary sewer, these low temperature ambient loops. And what we ask projects to do when they come in is really to do sort of an analysis of the regulatory context that they're working within. So looking at not only what the city of Boston has, the BPDA for zoning and regs, but also what's at the state level and what are some other regulatory issues or hurdles that might be in place that we want them to flag, we can potentially help work with. And then that helps establish kind of the baseline case. So the business as usual case of like just doing the building as is, as a standalone project. And then we talk about how that can integrate and connect with the existing utility infrastructure. And then from there, we work with the teams to start developing proposed strategies. So they'll have identified some sort of key areas of interest based on existing conditions and analysis. And we'll have a good understanding of what the potential carbon emissions are for the project. We'll know what the various load typologies are within the project. So if there's, like I mentioned, a lab component with office, and then we have residential, we love it if there's a grocery store there because there's all that potential to capture that heat. If there's a pool involved, if they want to do an ice skating rink, all these things that we can start combining and thinking about in terms of shared load capacity. And we'll identify key technologies to investigate. What we've done a lot recently is actually looked at waste energy as a key strategy for them to study. And then they come back to us with this feasibility report to get an understanding of what's the cost benefit analysis, what's the ROI, is this actually going to happen? What incentives are out there, all that fun stuff, and compare it to the base use case. So within part one, as I mentioned, we're really starting to frame the sort of regulatory aspect of it. So BERDO is a big part of it. Proposed zero net carbon targets that we have at the BPDA through our Article 37 review. Heat mitigation and adaptation, layering that on as a key principle, and then resilience. And when I talk about resilience, that's not only coastal sea level rise, but also thinking about in terms of environmental justice resilience and what that means to that particular community. And then from there, we're really getting into the more feasibility aspect where we start to, again, look at the heating and cooling demands overall, the standalone project versus the district project. And then in this case, we'll probably start considering what's the water balance of the system, what are the needs associated with that, and other opportunities that might be available. From there, we get this sort of proposed strategy and impact analysis that comes out of it. So sustainable and equitable resource management, really, what is being put in place and how is that sort of impacting not only the project, but the broader project outside of itself. Again, thinking from a broader planning perspective, citywide. And then what sort of is associated with land use or improvements that could happen, any sort of mitigation that can occur. If we're talking about somewhere that has to design to a specific flood elevation, can that be incorporated within the strategy? And then how does that start to impact urban heat island? And then also, how are we looking at this at public health and biodiversity in general? We also like to look at whole life cycle costs of the project. So thinking about that in terms of, just overall efficiencies and what comes back on maybe a 30-year term. Well, started to tease out principles of what does a 30-year operational cost look like in compared to a traditional ROI. And then I just wanted to highlight one thing that we're always looking at is sort of like, where are the opportunity areas? So this is our current Dorchester Avenue corridor. These are all projects that are currently within our BPDA pipeline for new development. And when I look at this, I just see untapped potential in terms of innovation, and how we can sort of start thinking about, okay, we have these connected networks that already exist underground. How do we start to utilize them and incorporate them to this work? So this represents about 15 million square feet in one corner of Boston alone. And just thinking about the associated impacts that this might have, over the course of the next 10 to 15 years as these projects get phased in, and really harnessing and capturing and future-proofing our city through a lot of these, network strategies. So really our goals and priorities as it stands right now, as I recognized earlier, we don't have a standard for thermal decarb in our underground standards, but that's something we would want to start working on. It's a big interest of mine. And then how do we expand capacity and resources for this within the city and within the BPDA? How do we sort of increase capacity overall for electrification more broadly and fuel switching as we start to look at BERDO and retrofits and tying, wastewater energy into that concept? How do we, develop policy for these new waste energy technologies? So, working with our partner agencies on thinking about a framework for that. Maybe it's using the advanced energy feasibility assessment that we have as a baseline, but tweaking that to align a little bit more with thermal decarbonization. How do we increase pilot opportunities? I look to the state partners on that one. And then, maybe we can think about how we incorporate that into new construction projects. And then how do we kind of work through this multi-user or third-party ownership model, which has been out there and has shown, success from a ROI or proposal perspective that we've seen in the past, and, kind of teasing that out. So you'll see here, this is just our electrification map, and then this is heat gas pipe replacement map. And you can see that it's really sort of a network of things that we can utilize and tap into. So that is it for me. Thank you.